Good evening, and welcome to our first Thursday event in NLC's fall series, The Power of Trees. I'm Barb Woolley, and I'm a member of the program committee. Before I welcome our esteemed speaker, Dr. Margaret Lowman, I'd like to begin by offering a land acknowledgement. Northumberland County is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. This territory has been inhabited and cared for from the beginning by Indigenous peoples, including Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Beausoleil, and Georgina Island First Nations, and is part of the Williams Treaties. We are all treaty people. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Margaret Lowman, more popularly, I can't speak tonight. She's mostly known as Canopy Meg. How's that? Dr. Lowman is a world-renowned biologist, researcher, and educator whose life mission, or Mission Green, is saving trees and all that lives in them. Dr. Lowman is a self-described Arbornaut, or should I say Arbornaut. Her innovative research and field studies, accessing and exploring the tree canopies, has brought the world's attention to the 8th continent, where incredibly over 50% of all species live. Engaging collaboratively with local people, Dr. Lowman's conservation work focuses on preserving the world's great forests and to mitigate issues of climate change, biodiversity, and species extirpation, harmful agricultural practices, logging, and forest fires. She regularly mentors the next generation, especially women and the underrepresented, in sustainability and forest stewardship. And she fosters eco-economic opportunities. In April, Dr. Lowman was awarded the prestigious Explorers Medal by the National Geographic Explorers Club, recognize her incredible, ground-defying work. Primatologist Jane Goodall suggests that Dr. Lowman is a courageous explorer who captures the magic of a little-known world. Following Dr. Lowman's presentation tonight, which will run about 45 to 50 minutes, we'll open up the conversation for your questions. Please feel free to submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just click and start typing. We're excited to hear about your explorations, Dr. Lowman, so I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Barb. I'm really honored to be here and excited to talk about my favorite subject, which is trees. So I will try to go ahead and share my screen and make sure that we can get things going here. So you just let me know if for any reason we don't have traction on this screen sharing activity. Okay, is that good? Hopefully, if it's not, you'll let me know. So I'd love to hear from the audience. Raise your hand if you ever climbed a tree in your life. Of course, I can't see all of you, but maybe some of you are raising your hand, and hopefully in your childhood or maybe your adulthood, you climbed a tree. And it's a really, I think, sort of a primate related experience, but for most of us, it engenders some level of fun and activity with nature. And so I think it's really important that we dedicate a lot of this power of trees to bringing kids into environmental ethics and environmental knowledge. And for me as a mom, it's really important that I think hard about, as an Arbornaut, how I can influence and help leave a legacy for the next generation. So here are some of my famous and aspiring Arbornauts. I've trained hundreds of kids around the world to climb trees, and I hope that all of you too take your kids out into nature, which is really exciting and fun. So why do I do that? Well, part of my motivation is that as a kid, I was basically in that generation where girls could never become scientists. Admittedly, I didn't even have a woman science teacher, so my role models were all deceased Rachel Carson for her amazing work on DDT to save songbirds, and Harriet Tubman, this fantastic lady that led some of the slaves north on the Underground Railway, using moss by night to navigate her pathway. To me, she was an incredible naturalist. So when I was in 5th grade with my little wildflower collection, my teacher said, well, take it to the New York State Science Fair. In fact, I grew up not too far from Toronto. And so I took these wildflower collections and entered this science fair with about 500 boys, all with these volcano experiments. Remember those which exploded when you put vinegar on them? And there I was in this gymnasium, tongue-tied, so shy. And lo and behold, I got a second prize, which was pretty amazing, and a little plastic trophy. But for a day or two, I felt like maybe I was Marie Curie or Rachel Carson, which was kind of exciting. So that was my genesis, but my science was all outdoors, collecting things, putting them under my bed, which my mother hated because all the mice came and tried to eat everything that I collected. But lo and behold, I ended up using all of those collection skills to become a scientist. In fact, I looked at my family genealogy, how many Lowmans are there in the world of science? And unfortunately, I couldn't find anything except my great grandfather during the Prohibition took the corn crop that he raised in upstate New York and turned it into a bit of bootleg. So I guess that was the closest my family ever came to being a botanist or a botanical skill. And so then I came along and collected these darn wildflowers in telephone books when I was a little kid. So why and how did I come from a very small town in upstate New York and become a scientist? I kind of laugh because most of my friends still live in my hometown, and my 3 best friends from kindergarten are still in my hometown. But here's a picture of one of my few high school buddies that left Elmira, New York. On the left is a guy named Tommy Hilfiger, and he was a crazy high school colleague who made bell-bottom jeans with his mom's sewing machine and sold them out of the back of his used jalopy. And lo and behold, he became a fashion designer of some notoriety. And he was very passionate about fashion. And I am on the right there, and I was very passionate about plants. His sister in the middle is my best friend still, and she became a nurse because she loved healing things. So I always tell kids, follow your passion if you can. If it's obviously in fashion, you should definitely pursue it, because probably Tommy could afford to save all the forests that I'm trying to saving by writing a check. But at the same time, we need everybody who loves what they do to pursue it. And I hope that a lot of young people will follow in the footsteps of trying to work on our environment, which is super important right now. So trees and all of the studies of trees has a crazy history. And this is pretty amazing, but for about 200 years, nobody ever studied the whole tree. They only studied the bottom. Foresters would walk in a forest, they would look at the trunk, they would estimate the board feet, and they would cut the tree down. And the only time they ever saw the top of a tree was if they actually cut it down. And by then, of course, anything that lived up there was either squished or had flown away. So the early tree research on the whole tree was just try to reach whatever you could, which was usually about 10 or 12 feet high. In my book called The Arbornaut, I equate it to, maybe being a forester or maybe being a doctor who looked at your big toe when you went in with a terrible problem with your eyesight or your ears. And he said, oh, I'm looking at your big toe and your health is just fine. It would not be a good way to have a relationship with a doctor. In fact, you'd probably switch doctors. But in the case of trees, nobody ever looked at the whole tree till a few crazy people like me came along and said, oh my gosh, we're missing 95% of the tree. And so as the first, or maybe one of the earliest arbonauts in the world, I got to design all of the tools in the toolkit. And this word arbornaut's kind of crazy. We had aquanauts in the 1940s when scuba gear was devised. We had astronaut in the 1960s when the first person went to the moon, but it wasn't until the 1980s that we had real arbonauts, me and a couple other folks who actually went to the tops of trees and explored the whole tree, not just the bottom of the tree. So that's where the word Arbornaut came from. And again, as I mentioned, I just published a book about my memoirs and my crazy misadventures climbing trees, mostly with men and foresters who all said women shouldn't be here. And so it gave me a lot of passion to not only save trees, but maybe mentor girls and other minorities to study forests and help us save these precious environments that we need for our kids to have a healthy life on Earth. So here's a little bit of a rundown of this amazing toolkit that I was so privileged to invent and design. And it was 1979 when I first became a graduate student at the University of Sydney in Australia. And my advisor said, well, if you want to study rainforest leaves, you'll have to get to the top of the tree. And I thought, oh my gosh, I could maybe train a monkey or use binoculars. But he said, no, 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 you have to get up that tree. So lo and behold, I welded a slingshot out of a piece of metal in the university shop, and I sewed a harness out of some seatbelt webbing, and I borrowed a few ropes from the caving club at the University of Sydney and went up my first tree in the Australian rainforest. I was really scared. I was shaking. I was so sure I would fall, but lo and behold, when I got to the top of that first tree, there were millions of things all around me, pollinating, eating, being eaten, doing all sorts of important things up in the treetops, just zillions of creatures that nobody could see from ground level. So it totally converted me into the world's first Arbornaut. And today, a lot of my students continue to study the treetops. Here's Anthony, who is 330 feet high in a redwood tree in California. Anthony discovered that redwood foliage can take in water from the fog. It doesn't have to actually go up the tree from the roots 330 feet. So he became a real hero when we're trying to understand how to save our endangered redwood trees. And here's some of my students in Taiwan, where some of the tallest trees in the world grow. And the kids are so small compared to the tree that I actually had to circle their little bodies so you could see them. But again, these kids all climb the tree by putting a rope up with a slingshot to put a fish line up and then haul a rope up, and then using the slingshot to put another length of rope up and a slingshot again to put another length of rope up so they could get to the tops of these amazing important trees and study what lives up there. Some of my other students studied those animals that lived up there. There's Bryson, who became a real expert in actually studying animals in the treetops. He could even capture sloths and monkeys. And he was so interested, especially in sloths, because everybody thinks they're very lazy. And so Bryson thought, well, you know what? When he looked at the scientific literature, he found out that sloths sleep about 16 hours a day in the cages of laboratories. But he went out into the wild and put little brain monitors on wild sloths, and he found out that they only sleep 5 or 6 hours a day in the wild. So I guess the moral of the story is if you were in a cage all day in a laboratory, you would probably sleep a lot too. So we had a very wrong notion about sloths before a few arbonauts climbed trees to study sloths where they lived. And a lot of my students over the years have not only made amazing discoveries, but they've had a lot of fun studying trees and learning to climb, and in turn teaching others to climb, sometimes even at night, where we had to discover the things that are active in the forest nocturnally, not just by daytime. So the rope in the harness is fantastic for one climber. But in my toolkit, I thought, wow, how could I get a whole classroom of students into the canopy? How could I get a whole group of volunteers, which we call citizen scientists, in the canopy? So I was very privileged to be part of a team that developed the first canopy walkway or skywalk in the world, which was in Australia in 1985. And I must confess that this was at an ecotourist lodge where I sat with the director one night of the lodge. We drank a beautiful bottle of Australian red wine and we drew on a little napkin. What if we could have a trail in the sky where I could take volunteers to study what lived in the treetops? And lo and behold, we took that little napkin and we turned it into an engineering design. And this walkway in Australia is still going strong. It totally turned the culture of Australia around to save rainforests instead of cutting them down. We now have a suite of walkways around the world. This method and this tool for treetop studies is fantastic because it also helps educate the public and it helps give people a lot of thrill and a lot of joy to go in the treetops. When I came back from Australia to the US, I built the first walkway at Williams College in Massachusetts, where all of my students made amazing discoveries in the temperate forests because no one had ever studied their treetops before. And then I moved down to Florida to become a botanical garden director. And lo and behold, the first public canopy walkway in North America was built at Myakka River State Park outside of Sarasota, Florida, where I now live. And this walkway, amazingly, costs only $150,000 to build, but it brings in about $30 million a year in revenue and 500,000 visitors, not revenue just to the state park, of course, but revenue to the hotels and restaurants and visitors who come to Florida to walk in the treetops. So here are some of my very star students in the Florida Treetop Walk. These third graders not only had a field trip to the canopy in Florida, but they watched and observed a new species of weevil eating the foliage, and they actually became published authors in the scientific literature, which leads us to realize that you don't have to be old and have a PhD to be a scientist. You could be a third grader who just has a good power of observation and some ability to get into the tops of the trees. There are lots of other cool walkways in the world, and I'll talk a little more later about these. The longest one in the tropics is in the Amazon of Peru, and that's fantastic. Another super long walkway is up in your neighborhood of the woods, northeast of Toronto, and maybe some of you have been there. And another very new and exciting walkway is in Malaysia. This walkway is exciting because we not only built it in a beautiful site above Penang, Malaysia, but we did a bio-blitz there. We did a whole 2-week study of all the creatures in the canopy and found 1,500 species and submitted that to the UNESCO World Heritage Program. And so this whole area has become a UNESCO World Heritage Site preserved in perpetuity, which is really exciting, thanks to the walkway that we built there. Other walkways quite close to you in Canada might be this brand new one in Quechee, Vermont, which has great access to temperate trees. And in the fall, it looks super beautiful with all the leaves changing color. It even has its own spider web because some of the activities that the park encourages for kids to love insects and arachnids. So you can go and play in the spider web if you so desire. So those are 2 tools. We have ropes with slingshots and harnesses. We have canopy walkways, but the third tool in the toolkit of any Arbornaut is this construction crane, but a little more limited in its extent because they cost about $1 million to establish. In the world of forest research, that's a huge amount of money. In the world of medical research or physics, it's not much money at all, but unfortunately, we don't spend a lot of money researching what lives in our backyard trees, but we spend a whole lot of money on other things. So these construction cranes are only found in 10 forests around the world, but they do give scientists a really great access to everything that you can reach within the bucket of the crane, which is pretty cool indeed. I worked on these cranes in Panama and in Australia, and it was a fabulous way to have easy access to the treetops. The fourth and final method in my toolkit is this famous and fabulous thing called inflatable gadgets. And I was so lucky to be part of some expeditions to use the hot air balloon and also this fantastic triangle called the luge, which can land on nearby trees when the balloon is sailing past. And so we've done these expeditions around the world. But I must confess that the first one in Cameroon, Africa, where I had to apply, as did all scientists, because the positions for this expedition were very competitive. And I applied as M. Lowman, not as Margaret Lowman. I guess some of you can probably guess why I did that, but I didn't want to give away my gender because I knew that I wouldn't get accepted in the expedition. So I arrived at that canopy site in Cameroon as the only woman out of 50 scientists. And oh my gosh, I learned a lot of French expletives at the time. They were not happy about my presence. And lo and behold, we all became fabulous friends because I was a good tree climber, and we all became lifetime colleagues in this world of the Arbornaut. But it wasn't easy in those days to be a woman climbing trees. It was definitely a challenge. Here's our field camp actually in Cameroon, Africa. My tent was the last one out of 50 tents, and right off the edge of this amazing primitive hut with a roof over the top was this poisonous Gabon viper living in a hole. And I'm sure that half of those guys were hoping I would step on it in the middle of the night when I was going to the outhouse. But fortunately, I did not. And those were part of the challenges of being a woman in science in those days. Here's our amazing raft that we used in conjunction with the inflatable balloon. And these inflatable spokes supported a trampoline so we could go up at night and study all of the cool creatures. Here I am climbing up a rope from the forest floor in the middle of the night in Cameroon, because a lot of the insects that I study eating leaves only eat leaves at night so they can avoid being eaten by birds during the day. So I had to spend a lot of time doing night climbing, which was pretty adventurous indeed. Sometimes we have a few crazy things, but these are not really a common part of the toolkit for Arbonauts. I worked in Bhutan where we had to survey the low forest canopy by elephant back. And of course, I've used drones. I've used different kinds of gadgets like camera traps in the forest canopies to try hard to understand what lives up there. So lots of creative ideas, but nothing beats being up there yourself and really seeing which bug eats which leaf and which bird is in which nest and which leaf is living longer than the others. So we still need these very basic tools like ropes and walkways to learn about the forest treetops, which I call the eighth continent because it's so unknown. It's almost like Columbus going to the New World. So what have we discovered? Oh my gosh. The biggest, most amazing thing is that half of the species in the world live in the tops of trees. This means if you have a tree in your backyard, you probably have a new species up there, but I'm guessing you probably never went up there to survey what lives up there. So there's so many incredible and wonderful things living in the tops of trees that most human beings have never seen. Everything from different kinds of plants to amazing ants, probably zillions of ants. This one has a rear end that looks like a leaf in the tropical jungle, which is a fabulous camouflage. Lots of birds. Here's this fabulous frigate bird living in the mangroves of the Galapagos. Lots of different kinds of frogs and toads and snakes, such as this red-eyed tree frog in Belize. Billions of insects and millions of species of beetles, like this Christmas beetle in Australia, and then lots of mammals like this beautiful koala in the bottom left. So all kinds of things that haven't ever really been researched very well, and many things which have never been studied before. So not only do trees house half of the species on the planet, but they're $1 million machine sitting in your backyard. And every single tree is so valuable that it kind of scares me that we cut them down willy-nilly. We do need to cut trees down. I will talk about that later because we need toilet paper and timber, but we can make plantations to do that. We should probably never cut down our old big trees, what we call our primary forests, because so few of them are left. So what do trees do that's worth so much income to us if we wanted to equate trees into dollars and cents? Trees provide fresh water. They cleanse water through their foliage so that we can get fresh water. They produce oxygen, of course, from the sun. They provide us with timber and food and clothing in many cultures. Some of my favorite foods are from trees: chocolate, oranges, cherries. Oh my gosh. Can you name a few things that you love from trees? Probably you can. Tree roots conserve our soil, and we all know that when trees are cut down, rivers flood and towns get lots of problems from that, and the river becomes very muddy because the soil floats down to the ocean. Trees, as we know, are home to 50% of Earth species. We now know, thanks to Arbornauts, that big, tall tree trunks store lots of carbon, which really helps our planet because humans, unfortunately, release so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And trees are a giant climate control. They're a huge, fantastic agent in controlling climate change. They shade us, they provide moisture, they help control weather patterns by large forest tracts, dealing with how they control atmospheric cycling. And so they're a really huge positive influence on climate control. And finally, for about 2 billion people in the world, maybe not as many in Canada or North America, but some, trees are a huge spiritual heritage. And we know with Indigenous people in Canada, we know with African cultures and Asian cultures and most people in India that trees are a spiritual heritage for their ancestors, for their worship, and for all kinds of really, really important reasons to keep trees alive and healthy. So here's our beautiful canopy, our multi-million-dollar machine that keeps us all healthy. And yet humans in the developed world continue to cut them down without too much knowledge. And it all boils down to education. A lot of people never learned the value of trees in business school or never studied the value of trees if they majored in a language or English literature, or maybe even something like history. So unfortunately, we have a lot of problems conserving trees by people who don't really understand their value. I also, as a mom, and a lot of you probably feel the same, value trees because they keep our kids so healthy. And it's really important to think about the fact that trees not only provide us with a fabulous environment for kids, but they empower kids if they climb trees or go to forests or learn about nature at school. And these girls here are part of the Meg Lowman Treetops Camp in my hometown of Elmira, New York. For 20 years, I've been mentoring and teaching girls to climb trees because my town is kind of economically underdeveloped. And so it's really great to give these girls a heads up and maybe help them to be empowered about thinking of careers in science, or just helping them be a little more brave and bold. Canopies can be useful for all kinds of diverse people. I've had a 5-year grant from the National Science Foundation in the US government to teach kids who are mobility limited to climb trees. And we've adapted some pulleys and a few other techniques to allow these amazing kids who usually think they have to sit indoors for their science classes to get out into the forest and explore the treetops. And Rebecca, the girl on the left, discovered 3 new species in the canopies of Kansas, if you can believe it, just by climbing into the treetops. And so it's been a fantastic experience to take kids who might not think they could become scientists and help them train in that field. And here's what Rebecca discovered. Anybody know what this is? I'll take a sip of my water while you think about that. I don't know if any hands are raised, but this cool little microscopic creature is called a water bear or a tardigrade, and millions of them live in the treetops. And we are discovering new water bears every time we explore the top of a new species of tree. So that was Rebecca's great contribution. And I have to mention one funny thing, but water bears live in drops of water. So they live on foliage of leaves in the rainforest. They live in the bark of trees. They live in mosses at the top of oak trees or maple trees. And unfortunately, for anybody in the audience who thinks that they are a vegetarian, they live in drops of water on broccoli and lettuce. And so nobody is really a vegetarian, because whether we like it or not, we're probably eating hundreds of water bears a day and maybe getting a little bit of protein from them. But it's just that they love being in those drops of water on any kind of green vegetation. So you too are probably a consumer of these crazy water bears. So what about forests? Around the world, outside of Canada and North America, we have many countries where the forests are almost gone. And we experienced that in the US, where 97% of trees were cut down 150 years ago, but a lot has been regrown. That doesn't mean all the species came back, and it doesn't mean all the trees are as good as they used to be, but we do have a little bit greener landscape. But in a lot of countries, they are too poor to do good conservation. And so part of my mission as a senior scientist in the world of forest conservation is to help countries that need help to save their forests, because our kids need the whole world to save forests, not just our own backyard. And one of my major projects has been in Ethiopia, where less than 3% of the forests remain in the northern half of the country. And you can see this circle of trees here, which is called a church forest. It surrounds the round church, the Ethiopian Coptic or Orthodox Church, which believes that the priests there are the stewards of the human spirit, but they're also the stewards of all of God's creatures. So in Ethiopia, a successful church has trees around it. I'm embarrassed to admit that in America, a successful church usually has a parking lot around it. So that's not such an exciting thing. But in Ethiopia, I've been working with the priests for the last 15 years. And here's a picture of the landscape from Google Earth, where you can appreciate how much of the land has been cleared for subsistence agriculture, because they don't have any irrigation or tractors or tools for farming, and how little is left, which is all these tiny dots surrounding the church. So to help them save these important native trees, I've been doing workshops with the chief priest. Here's the chief priest of Bahir Dar of northern Ethiopia. And this is a unique partnership of church and science, which usually people say, oh, they don't go together. But guess what? They really do go together, because both of us really believe in having stewardship for all of God's creatures, or in my case, for all of biodiversity. So to achieve this, I've been giving workshops every year for all the priests around different rural parts of Ethiopia, usually the only girl, because most of the priests are men, in which case they are really amazed. They're like, holy cow, this must be really important if this lady came all the way from the US to talk to us about our trees, and explain to them things they didn't know. They don't have computers, they don't have cell phones, they don't have maps illustrating that most of the trees in the next valley have been cut down. So they need the knowledge to appreciate how special their church forests really are, and to fix things to try to keep those last pieces of forests alive and healthy. We've started building conservation walls, where I raise money in the developed world and bring it to Ethiopia to pay for the gates, to pay to haul the stones, and then all the people build the walls free. donate the stones for free from the farmer's field. And lo and behold, we end up with these fantastic walls protecting all of the remaining biodiversity of Ethiopia. So this is one example of how we can help countries that are underprivileged from the point of view of funding or intellectual knowledge about science, and help them save their biodiversity before it's too late. And today you can go to Ethiopia, and we have a project to put walls around the 40 most important forests. Here's the first one we did outside of Bahir Dar in a forest called Zara. And you can see the amazing difference inside and outside of the wall. And you can also meet some of the children who are so excited to go inside and sample the bugs and learn the plants of their forest. And even better, I wrote a children's book in their language to help the kids understand why are the trees important to them. And what's been really special to me is that most kids in Ethiopia have never owned one book. They don't have pencils or paper in school for the most part. They have no books in school. So I take these books over, I buy a couple hundred and put them in a duffel bag, and we go to Ethiopia and hand them out at the schools, girls first, and then we help them understand the importance of their trees, which is really, really important for the next generation of Ethiopian leaders. So this leads me to my final part of the talk, which is the big challenge. And I'm embarrassed to tell you something. In my lifetime, half of the world's primary forests have been cut down by all of us because we want to buy things like beef or soy or products from Brazil, or because we want to clear land for cities, or because we want to clear land for roads or plant crops for agriculture. But unfortunately, we're reaching a tipping point where there aren't enough trees left to support the biodiversity of the world, or keep our climate healthy, or provide us with fresh water. So what do we do about that? And especially for me as a forest scientist, I think I can't just retire and sit around and read books and go on a sailboat all day, but I think I have to do something important. So I've tried to take my 40 plus years of tree climbing experience and the 40 plus countries where I've worked and say, I think I can perhaps create a project that might be helpful. And I relied on a friend of mine named Sylvia Earle, who started a project a little bit over 10 years ago called Mission Blue. And she's an oceanographer, and she thought the same as me. She said, how can I help my beautiful oceans? So her project, Mission Blue, helps bring attention to very important hope spots in the ocean that people should save because they have coral reefs or because they have big areas of fish hatcheries. So she's been working hard on Mission Blue. And I started a partner project called Mission Green, where I want to take the world's most important forests and make sure that we can save a little piece of them to provide sanctuary for the biodiversity and educate people about forests and provide employment for women and families from indigenous communities to be part of the ecotourism industry in their forests. And how I'm going to do that is what I'm just about to say. But my partner in crime was a very famous scientist who just passed away last year, Ed Wilson, wrote a book called Half Earth, where he studied and actually quantified the most important forests we need to save. So I took Ed's list and met with him for many lunchtimes, and we came up with this project called Mission Green, where we would build 10 canopy walkways costing $10 million in the 10 most highly endangered and high biodiversity forests, hired 10 times 10, meaning 100 local indigenous women and families to work on ecotourism there as guides for the walkway, as chefs for ecotourism lodges, as boat drivers to get to the walkways, and then hopefully end up having about 1,000 next generation explorers come and use these walkways for discovery. And through this 10 by 10 by 10 by 10 mission, we can in turn save what I call the library, the genetic library, meaning the biodiversity of species in these last pieces of really important forests that are disappearing. So here are the 10 places. And I'm happy to say that Mission Green, in its 3 years of existence, is almost half completed. We have a walkway in the Sequoia, in the redwood forests of California. We have a walkway in the subtropical forests of Florida. We have a walkway in the Amazon of Peru, and we have a walkway in Malaysia. So we now are working on funding a walkway in Madagascar. We are about $500,000 short of that $1 million project. And then we want to move on to India and the Great Smoky Mountains and Gorongosa in Mozambique, and finally the Atlantic forests in Brazil. So please keep in touch with me about this progress. We're really excited to try to save the lemurs. Did you know that Madagascar has less than 3% of her forests left, just like Ethiopia? So this is a pretty urgent site for us to build a canopy walkway to ensure that those trees are never cut down and to ensure that local people make an income without logging. So finally, by 2030, maybe I'll be in my grave, and I just hope that we can have this $10 million to fund these 10 walkways in the 10 most important forests of the world. And all of this is illustrated in the last chapter of my book, where I walk through all of my crazy misadventures as an Arbornaut, but end up by explaining how maybe I and some of the rest of us can have hope to save important forests with all of their amazing biodiversity and give that to our children as probably the most important inheritance that they will ever have. So with that, I will stop and I will turn off my screen share. Here's a couple websites if you're interested, but I want to make sure that Barb can take over with the Q&A, and hopefully she can become the person that you can address questions to. So thanks for listening, and back to you, Barb, if I can get this ready to stop sharing. Okay, back to you. Thank you, Barb.
Amazing, thank you. Not only are you an amazing scientist, you're really a techie too. And clearly you paid attention in your shop class in order to weld your
oh my gosh, isn't that crazy? Can you believe it?
I don't know how you did that. But thank you so much for that inspiring and engaging talk. We would like to open it up to some audience questions. So just a reminder, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and just type away. So the first question that comes up is, what about forests in Indonesia, which has one of the highest rates of deforestation?
Right, great. So I've lumped Malaysia, Indonesia. Those Southeast Asian forests have a very similar group of trees called the dipterocarps, which are probably the most economically important trees in the world. And they are all being cut down and replaced with the palm oil industry, which is very, very heartbreaking. And I'm really excited about our walkway in Penang, Malaysia, because it was funded by one philanthropist in the city of Penang who saw the vision and really knew that he had to educate people in both Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, that whole region about saving trees. The sad thing for all of us is that palm oil is all of our fault. In other words, we have it in nail polish, in plastic upholstery, in shampoo. We Americans buy the palm oil, which is the reason those forests in Indonesia and Malaysia are being logged. And somehow we need to figure out a way to give people more indication. I don't think people purposefully buy shampoo or nail polish to kill the trees. I think they don't realize the contents of the products that they buy, and we need better labeling. We need better transparency in our consumer markets. And so, yes, we're super, super excited about walkways in Malaysia, Borneo, and Indonesia. And so I've lumped them all together, and we might go back and need to build another one specifically in Indonesia, but we are pretty well represented. We have one in Borneo, we have one in Malaysia, but right now we're just really prioritizing putting these walkways where people over there can get to them. They're not too remote, so that everybody can learn from them, which is exciting. And that's why Penang was great, because 2 million people live in Penang. and 2 million people visit Penang. So that walkway is getting over 1 million visitors a year, which is really great for the education part of that project.
Oh, well, thank goodness. There was a question around making the forests and the skywalks accessible, so I think you've answered that. What kind of places or cities or governments, for example, are kind of leading the way in forest management, who understand the importance of trees?
Well, a lot of the advancements are in places where it's really desperate. For example, Singapore is a fantastic city where every single tree is valued, and they've invested over $20 million in walkways, if you can believe it. They're boardwalks through parks in the city to make sure that people go there, have weddings there, have abilities to see nature there, which is really very thrilling and exciting and wonderful to see. Canada has a great track record. As you know, British Columbia has some fantastic access to trees. And as I mentioned, there's a walkway outside of Toronto that's fabulous. So people are, I think, coming together to do their share. I think the scary thing is it's a little bit like environmental justice and social equity. Unfortunately, the poor countries oftentimes house the highest and most valuable biodiversity, but they don't have the money for conservation, and they don't have the academic or intellectual power to think through how to save the trees. So somehow we need to tackle forests globally and not just in our own backyard. We need to recognize it as a global force, because as we all know, when forests burn in Canada, it affects the US. And when trees get cut down in Indonesia, it affects everybody's quality of life. So we have to view trees as a beautiful global property and figure out how to share responsibility if we ever could.
Thank you. How important a factor is religion and culture in valuing trees, given
That
that you
is
do
a
a lot
great
of work in
question.
Ethiopia?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And this, I think, is a big surprise to a lot of Western people. I hate to admit it. And maybe in Canada, you all are a little bit more sensitive, because I loved your opening where we pay, respect to Indigenous people and those who were on the land before many others, and try to think through that. But I think the spiritual heritage is huge and cannot be overlooked. And the crazy thing is, nobody's put a dollar value on it. Unfortunately, so many forests are only saved because economists come in and say, we need to know the value of this forest. How much is it worth? Blah, blah, blah. And it's hard to value spirituality. You can't say, my religious heritage is worth $10 a day. In India, everybody values the beautiful big fig tree in their village, but nobody says any kind of dollar value on that. So I think we Westerners have a lot to learn from other places and other religions to think about the value of trees. And if we could embrace the spiritual value of trees a little more, we would probably have so much more conservation. It would be amazing if we could do that. I would just love that to happen. And one wonderful story that I didn't mention, the Great Smoky Mountains is the highest biodiversity forest in North America. I don't know if you knew that. So I've been working with the Cherokee Nation, and they are going to fund not just one, but 3 walkways from their casino proceeds. So they want to value their children, their elders, and their schools. They want to have walkways in each region of their land so that all these people can be serviced by the love of nature. So I think they're exemplary in trying to relate their spiritual strength to the dollar value of making sure their trees are appreciated by their future generations, which is really special.
Oh, that's a great story. I wonder, someone is asking about the tree walk or the skywalk that's close to Toronto. Is it the Ganaraska tree trekking place? It's north of Port Hope, if you know that name.
Uh, no, it's not. And I'm just kicking myself. I'm having a
Oh,
senior moment. It's near a lake. It's northeast of Toronto, about an hour and a half.
oh, I think it's
Or
in Haliburton. Yes,
Yes,
yes.
yes, yes, yes. And
Yeah.
it's huge. It's very skinny, only 1%. It's a very rudimentary walkway where probably not a lot of people would want to go on it. Like the one in British Columbia is very robust and you can have a wedding up there. But the fact is, technically, you do have the longest walkway in the world up in Canada. So I wanted to tell you that so you would know that.
We have a very big country that's not quite populated, so we have a little more space, perhaps.
That's
Um,
great.
and yes, I was up in the redwood treetop canopy in Rotorua in New Zealand, and it was incredible because it was nighttime and it was lit by lanterns. And if anyone goes to New Zealand, they should do this. It's fantastic.
Oh, good for you. Great.
Um, I wonder how the canopies change as you go higher and higher up up
Oh,
the.
what a great question. Huge. And I think this is the problem for science that we overlooked for such a long time, this 50% of biodiversity living in the top of the tree. As you go up from the forest floor, which by the way has about 1% of light of the top of a tree, you get, of course, to the lower canopy, which is shady and pretty free of wind. And then you get to the mid canopy, which has little dappled light and it's quite beautiful. And then you get to the upper canopy, which has more light and more wind. And then finally, the actual top of the tree, where the leaves have to be so absolutely windproof and have a huge thick layer of cuticle to protect them from being dried out. And they're usually very small leaves to be kind of aerodynamic. So it's a whole different world at the very top of the tree and a huge change. And for us as scientists, that was a shock for me as one of the first explorers of the treetops to get to the top and find out it was a whole different world from the forest floor. And we still don't know much about that. If you could imagine, the International Canopy Conference is occurring next week. Only 100 people are attending. There aren't very many Arbornauts. And when you think there are over 50,000 species of trees, and they're all different everywhere, you realize like not very many trees have been studied for what lives in them and for what they specifically do in their physiology. So it's a great exploration world for kids who might be interested in doing work out in nature.
Last week we had a presentation of a book called The Overstory, which I'm sure you have heard about, given it won the Pulitzer. I wonder if you have read the book and what chance do trees have? For example, are they only going to survive or thrive in a post-human world? So
Right. Yeah. I love that book. And I'm very jealous of the author because he was male and I gather he got to work 8 hours a day on his book while all of his laundry and cooking was taken care of. And I was a single mom and I had to write all my books at 10 o'clock at night after my kids had done their homework and their grocery shopping was done. It's still a different world as an author for most of us. And so I'm very jealous of him. It's a beautiful book. Even though it was fiction, kind of superimposing all these people trying to save trees, I think the message is clear that we probably need more people to try to save trees and hopefully to save trees in ways that are all encompassing, not just California and the Pacific Northwest, but we need to really reach out and think about how do we save trees in places like Eastern Brazil and places like Madagascar and places like Indonesia. And it's really tough because you don't have probably as many creative and clever people as those wonderful stars of the Overstory that did such a beautiful job of saving their local trees.
that's certainly a work of fiction. The, I guess my, niggling thing, because that magnification of that water bear was kind of horrifying. I'm wondering, what is their purpose if they're on everything?
Oh,
What do
isn't
they
that
do?
great? And guess what, Barb? We don't really know. This is one of the million questions we have in the canopy. The one thing they do, and there's a whole world of the microorganisms, as you know, and water bears eat each other and they eat little other things like nematodes and bits of lichen and moss in the case of vegetarian water bears. But the bottom line is there are all these interactions and food chains in these little micro worlds that we hardly know about anything. But the cool thing about water bears, I forgot to mention, is they are called the most extremophile organism on the planet. They can turn into a ball when it gets hot or dry, and they can float away and land somewhere and start life again, even 100 years later. And they've actually been taken to the moon by NASA. They were on that Indian space shuttle, which crashed, and they've been released. And people think there's probably a population of them living in outer space. So it conjures up all kinds of wonderful science fiction. But the cool thing is they're incredibly extreme in terms of their survival. And there's a little bit of research going on to look at them in terms of how do we all have traits that allow us to survive extreme environmental conditions. So stay tuned. Maybe water bears will be the survivors on the planet. Who knows?
That's a very scary thought. Um, I wonder, what do you do with the trees that are infested? For example, here in Northumberland County, we deal with the ash borer beetle, and I've certainly seen the decimation of the pine beetle. What do you do? What happens?
Well, and that's a great question. I did most of my training in Australia, as you'll find in the book, where I studied the rainforest there. But then I moved on as I married into a sheep and cattle ranch family where we had millions of trees dying from that Christmas beetle, that beetle I had in one of the pictures. It's called dieback, when all sorts of trees die back from extreme conditions. We didn't know it in the 1980s, but that was the first kind of outcry of climate change, where in Australia it became extremely dry and extremely hot in the 1980s. And these beetles just broke out and killed every single gum tree on every single farm. And we wept. We didn't know what to do about it except plant new trees and be really patient. And I think the moral of the story was that we had altered our landscape. We had cut 90% of the trees down and left 10% for the sheep to shade under. We had tried to create better grazing land, but in doing that, we had changed the landscape from its natural state and allowed one species to really thrive, the enemy species, the beetle in this case, and the trees were the victims of that. And so I think in almost every case when you see an insect pest, there's two things happening. One is it's been introduced from all of human travel and mobility, that we've brought it from somewhere. And two is that we've altered the ecosystem enough so that we don't have the total natural forest anymore. We have species we love, like Americans lost the elms to the Dutch elm disease. Why? Because they left elms on every city street was lined with elms, because that was what Americans planted. Instead of having a diversity of trees, we had a dominance of elms. So we're in part responsible for this, but now, of course, the climate really encourages bugs to thrive. Bugs love hot and dry. And guess what? We have a lot of bouts of hot and dry. We also have floods, and we have rain, and we have cold, but we have enough hot and dry in many places where the insects are thanking us. They're saying, we love this. So we are a little bit in trouble for that. And it's not usually financially possible to protect our trees. It's very expensive and really scary. So we have to look to planting a little bit more diversity in the future, so that one insect won't take out the few species of trees that we have perhaps planted more than any others.
Another question has to do with another North American tree, and that's the chestnut. Do you know what's going on with trying to bring those back?
I do. And I actually have a chestnut desk that was my great grandfather's. I treasure it. I don't think anyone else would want it, but I just love the fact that, he was living in a day when chestnut was a beautiful timber. So yeah, right now, they're trying to clone and hybridize a Chinese species of chestnut with an American species, and it's becoming quite successful. And I'm not totally on top of the day-to-day updates on that, but I'm very optimistic that with, I hate to say it, but genetic modification, we're going to bring back a type of chestnut. It will never be the American chestnut right now, but it will be a variety of chestnut that might fill the niche of that original chestnut. And that's a problem for all of us, because even though we're scared of this genetic modification of things we eat or things we breed or things we grow, science is trying hard to solve things that humans have kind of originally caused. So we're in a dilemma, aren't we? Like how to deal with this ethically. Is it good or bad? Should we allow chestnuts to be extinct, or should we try to strengthen the genetic components and make them survivable? And, in Florida where I live, we're producing oranges that are more resistant to dry and hot, and we used to produce oranges that were more resistant to frost. So everybody's doing something. And if, you drink orange juice, you're drinking a genetically modified product. I hate to tell you, but it's just a very tough world to try to equate how science should move ahead with a lot of these technical advances. So not an easy situation.
I guess that kind of holds together the issue of the forest fires that kind of ravaged North America, Europe. I mean, obviously there's extreme heat, but what happens with replenishing that stock, or what happens to those nasty bugs in
Right.
forest fires?
Well, the good thing about a forest fire is it might kill the bugs. And the take home lesson for all of us is we need to plant a variety of trees. We need to be careful not to plant one species of tree. I lived in California for quite a while where people had planted eucalypts, and eucalypts are almost like planting an oily rag in your backyard. Their resin in the tree is very pro fire. They need fire for their seeds to pop and germinate for their seed pods. And so when you have eucalypts and the fire comes, the eucalypts love to be burned. It's just kind of a crazy thing. And that's caused billions of dollars of damage in California. So as humans, we have to be awfully careful to do our homework and try to plant natives and not plant exotics, and try to look into the history of how those plants need certain environmental conditions. And some trees really need fire and others don't. And it's tough in this world now, which is getting a little hotter and drier because of a lot of other factors like fossil fuels and, our human use of things that is changing things quickly. And so we're in a very, very delicate position to try to make the best decisions we can. But I don't think we can make perfect decisions, which is pretty tough to accept.
Yeah, I guess there's always hindsight. Given people, in Canada were tree planting for years and years and years, but those species aren't necessarily the best for, long-term sustainable.
Right. And I have read about that. Some of your spruces are like eucalypts. They need fire as part of their ecosystem health. And so it's just really sad when you've lost a lot of those expanses of one species due to fire. And now it's going to be tough to bring it back too.
If you'll indulge us, have you ever fallen out of a tree?
I have. So that's a very sobering lesson. And I must confess, I didn't fall far, 15 feet, but I fell far enough to say, oh, I'm just a girl and maybe I shouldn't be a scientist. It gave me a lot of pause in my career to have that fall. But it didn't ultimately stop me. And I'm very grateful I didn't break a bone. And the real lesson is like riding a bike. I tell kids, you have to pay attention to safety. I hadn't hooked on properly because it was just about to pour with rain and it was thundering and lightning and I had to get out of the tree really fast. You need to check your safety gear, just like your bike helmet, your brakes, and everything else. You want to make sure that you have all your safety gear engaged properly. And I was a little careless that day.
I guess it only takes once.
That's right.
Just a couple more questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
What tactics or arguments do you use to convince sort of a resistant group, for instance, governments or, perhaps economically disadvantaged, to practice conservation? Is there an economic argument? Is it an environmental argument? Is it, more than that?
Yeah. I think as a scientist, I want to say something that's really important. And a lot of times in science, people are a bit aggressive and they rush in and want to collect data because their ultimate goal is publishing papers, which local people don't care about and government officials have never read. So the metrics of success in science is maybe not very well matched up with the conservation mission. And so for me now, as a more senior scientist, the real metric is building trust with local communities, probably more than even high up government officials. If you go into communities and build trust, maybe it's with priests in Ethiopia, and maybe it's with another group in a different community somewhere else. Maybe it's with elders in a tribal community. Maybe it's with local people that are running the casino or whatever it is. But I think it has to be that we can explain the value of trees, not always monetary. I think the spiritual value is much more significant in many cultures. And we, again, as Westerners, need to understand how to talk about that and not try to value trees in dollars, which isn't respected by a lot of cultures. So it is tiptoeing in and finding out how to build the trust that's the most important. And that's something that we don't get taught in graduate school in science, and probably most people don't get taught in government school either. But I do think that's the real secret to success. And as a mom, you probably think about that a lot more because you're trying to build up trust with your kids and your kids' friends along the way. And so that they've taught me a lot, my children.
As I would 100% agree with that. Maybe a last question. What can we do, or what actions as an individual can we do to steward our forests?
Yeah.
You kind of, you feel kind of small, especially under something that's 300 feet high.
I know we all are small, but yet we all have to take action. A couple things, one is what you're doing now. I think educating people, reading books like The Overstory or my book help people really delve into the importance of trees, which is so huge. Sharing it with kids. There's 2 children's books about me you can see on my website, and they're great to buy for Christmas gifts so kids can start to appreciate and enjoy trees, which is important. But I think we have to be really, really vigilant about saving big trees. I think we've been a bit careless about allowing big trees to get cut down for road expansion, for shopping malls, for crazy things where it really doesn't add up. And to be honest, although I love kids planting trees, planting a new tree does not substitute for taking down a big tree. It takes 200 years in Australia for a seedling to be able to house a koala bear. It's not possible for the biodiversity to live in seedlings. So we need to know when we cut down a big tree, it's like cutting down a high rise in Toronto or New York City. It's just millions of things. It's not just one thing. And that's a huge ethical problem, but people don't realize that because they haven't studied trees in any way, or they haven't read a book like my book to understand that. So we need to, at all costs, save big trees. And then we need to go one step further, if we ever can, and help our governments and our food industry to label products a little better. And as I mentioned earlier, I think if people knew, if it said, this soy product caused the rainforest of Brazil to get cut down, you wouldn't buy it. If it said this shampoo came as a result of us cutting the forests of Indonesia, you'd say, well, I'd rather buy something else. So I think we are being misled a lot by the consumer industry to buy products that really are endangering our kids' future and cutting trees down. And if we could possibly get better labeling and try to buy local and try to buy products where the history of the landscape, instead of something that's come from halfway around the world that has a huge energy footprint and you're not really sure how many trees got cut down to produce it. Those would be fantastic things for all of us to try to do. Coffee is a great one. there's a lot of coffee that's coming from places where forests have been cut down, but the more expensive coffee is grown in the shade of the forest in places like Ethiopia, in some parts of Costa Rica, in some parts of Guatemala. But you almost need to go to Starbucks or whatever your coffee place is and say, would you give me the shade grown coffee? And if they say we don't know what that is, then you don't want to go back to that. You know, they need to know that you want the coffee grown in the shade of the trees, even though it costs 10% more, you're doing the right thing.
So that's going to leave us with a little bit of hope then.
Right. Have good coffee tomorrow for breakfast.
Exactly. Well, thank you so, so much for your engaging talk and for answering all of our questions. I would say to our audience, you really need to read Meg's book, if I can call you Meg, Canopy Meg, and it's at Furby Books. It's also at Let's Talk Books, and you can certainly find out more by looking at canopymeg.com, her website. And again, on behalf of our audience, just thank you so much for being here. And it was just such a great introduction to the tops of trees. We hear more sometimes about the bottom of trees or what's under the earth, and this was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy.
So I would just like to kind of close off our evening by saying that next week, Dr. Barbara Wall will be here. She's an Indigenous scholar from Trent University, and she'll be here to talk about trees as our mentors, as our educators, as our elders. It's a live event at the Cobourg Community Center, the Columbus Center, at 7:30, and tickets are still available on our website if you'd like to go there. As a reminder, becoming a connector is really important for supporting our organization, all that we do in terms of our programming. And so we appreciate our first connectors. Thank you. And to you for attending, thank you so much. And we'd love to hear your feedback. There'll be a little survey at the end of this webinar. And if you can provide that, that will just help us get better. Thanks so much and have a good Thanksgiving.